All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Whenever North Korea pops up in the news, we tend to picture this monolithic, totally unchanging state that's just perfectly sealed off from the rest of the world, right? But what if I told you that beneath the surface, a tragic economic collapse actually inadvertently birthed a massive underground revolution? Today, we're going to uncover a really gripping story of survival, unregulated markets, and a powerful generational shift that's literally transforming a closed society from the inside out.
To really wrap our heads around the sheer gravity of this cultural shift, we actually need to start with a life or death story. Listen to this quote. He jumped from a moving train to avoid execution. That belongs to a man named Kim Sung-min. He was once a state propaganda writer, a captain in the military, and his story of defiance is just absolutely gripping. It perfectly embodies a much, much larger national rebellion that's quietly taking place right under the regime's nose.
Section 1. Escaping the Hermit Kingdom.
So Kim's journey is a pretty dramatic one. Back in 1978, he joined the army, and he eventually rose up to become a propaganda writer. But then, by 1996, he came under suspicion for a letter he sent to his uncle in the South, so he defected to China. Well, he was caught, subjected to severe interrogation, and put on a train heading right back to Pyongyang where a death sentence was waiting for him. But miraculously, and I mean literally miraculously, in 1997, he actually leapt from that moving train. He survived, hid out for years, and finally made it to Seoul in 1999. 5 years after that, this former propagandist founded Free North Korea Radio to broadcast the actual truth back into his homeland.
Section 2. Birth of the Jong.
So how exactly did the conditions for this kind of information rebellion even emerge inside such heavily guarded borders? Well, it started with an absolute catastrophe. In the early 1990s, North Korea faced the end of Soviet financial support. You combine that with some massive, incredibly destructive floods in 1994 and 1995 that wiped out crops and power grids, and the state's public distribution system completely collapsed. State rations plummeted from 450 grams of food a day way down to a starvation level of just 128 grams. To put that into perspective, that is basically just a handful of dry rice for the entire day. The state simply could not feed its people anymore.
The fallout was catastrophic, resulting in a death toll of up to 1 million people. During what became known as the arduous march between 1994 and 1998, the entire state system just utterly failed. The population quickly realized that if they didn't fend for themselves, they were simply going to die. Survival meant breaking the rules.
And out of that sheer, unimaginable desperation, something entirely new was born, the Jongmadang. People started foraging, bartering, and illegally trading goods with China. What started as just individuals hawking their household possessions just to buy a tiny bit of grain, well, it turned into a grassroots, completely unregulated market system. The regime was so pressured by the sheer scale of the starvation that they really had no choice but to turn a blind eye.
Section 3. Markets and social change.
Now, these gray markets didn't just stay small-scale survival outposts. They quickly evolved into sophisticated hubs of commerce that permanently alter the fabric of North Korean society. Get this. Today, an estimated 83% of North Koreans aged 16 or older actually participate in these markets. The Jongmadang now counts for roughly 90% of household expenditures. It's essentially a shadow economy that has straight up become the actual economy.
So here's the real so what of it all. The economic reality is just staggering. An official state-mandated job pays an average of about 26 cents per month. But if you trade in these semi-illegal gray markets, you can earn up to 80 times more. Think about that. This single shift introduced concepts like profit, consumerism, and self-reliance to a population that until then had only ever known strict reliance on the state.
And this completely flipped the social structure upside down. Under state law, men were strictly confined to their mandatory, unpaid, or extremely low-paying state factory jobs. So who ended up running the markets? The ajumma, the middle-aged married women. They stepped out of the home, built these massive trading networks, and suddenly became the wealthy breadwinners of their families. It was a radical shift in gender and power dynamics for what had always been a highly patriarchal society.
Section 4. The information underground.
Once these trade routes and smuggling networks were established, the Jongmadang didn't just move food and clothing.
It inadvertently became this massive nationwide conduit for foreign culture and ideas. Traders looking for higher profits started smuggling in highly lucrative contraband. We're talking USB drives, cell phones, South Korean pop music, foreign DVDs, and portable MP4 players. Suddenly, citizens who had been entirely isolated by state propaganda for their whole lives were directly connected to the outside world. They were watching South Korean dramas and realizing, hey, our southern neighbors aren't these impoverished enemies we were told about. They're living in a wealthy, modern society.
Which brings us right back to activists like Kim Song-min. He tapped right into this new cultural openness by establishing Free North Korea Radio. And what made his approach so incredibly brilliant was his deep understanding of his audience. See, unlike outside broadcasters who use polite honorifics when they mention the regime's leaders, Kim's station intentionally used North Korean dialects and just dropped the honorifics entirely. He spoke to the people in a language they truly understood, which effectively bypassed and totally undermined the state's tight grip on information.
Section 5. The Jangmadong Generation.
This widespread access to information, combined with the reality of unregulated capitalism, gave rise to a totally unprecedented demographic. We are looking at a massive generational divide here. The older generations were raised with this built-in instinct for compliance, right? They lived during an era when the state genuinely provided for them. But the millennials, the ones raised during the starvation of the arduous march, who came of age entirely within the market system, they are known as the Jangmadong generation. They're highly individualistic, they're capitalistic, and honestly, because they owe their survival entirely to themselves and not the regime, they display a profound, deep mistrust of the government's propaganda.
Now, we have to look at the whole picture impartially here. This unregulated marketization, it brought some really severe negative consequences too. The lack of legal order has unfortunately empowered organized crime, including the trafficking of drugs and weapons. Tragically, it's also led to rampant gender-based violence. Female traders are incredibly vulnerable to extortion and sexual abuse by corrupt state police, who basically demand bribes or these unofficial stall taxes. On top of that, there's growing inequality, because rural populations simply don't have the same access to the lucrative networks that you find in the larger urban hubs.
Obviously, the state is fully aware of the threat these markets pose. In response to recent severe economic declines, Kim Jong-un has ruthlessly cracked down on these smuggling lifelines. The regime actually used the COVID-19 pandemic as a pretext to enforce extreme border restrictions, which isolated the country even further and cut off vital trade. In fact, in 2021, the regime went so far as to issue an ominous warning to its people to prepare for another impending period of starvation, basically threatening a new arduous march.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, you really have to ask yourself this one critical question. Yes, the state still wields immense, brutal power in the short term. But with an entire generation now raised on self-reliance, foreign media, and market capitalism, can the regime ever truly put the genie of the Jangmadang generation back into the bottle? It's a massive tension that will absolutely define the future of the Korean Peninsula. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this complex and deeply human story.